The first sign that something was amiss came on an ordinary Tuesday in April. I remember it clearly because it was the day the cherry blossoms in our front yard reached their peak bloom, a cascade of pale pink against the crisp blue sky, filling the air with a subtle fragrance that always reminded me of new beginnings. How ironic that would turn out to be. My name is Eleanor Blackwood, Eleanor Marie Blackwood. I was Eleanor Foster before I married Richard 12 years ago in what everyone called a fairy tale wedding, and for over a decade, I believed we lived a fairy tale life. Richard and I met in graduate school. I was pursuing my MBA while he was finishing his law degree. We were the power couple everyone admired, ambitious, attractive, and seemingly destined for success. After graduation, Richard joined a prestigious law firm specializing in corporate mergers and acquisitions, while I climbed the ranks at a financial consulting firm. We bought our dream house in the suburbs of Boston, a restored Victorian with a wraparound porch and enough bedrooms for the children we planned to have. But those children never came. After years of trying and 3 devastating miscarriages, we accepted that parenthood might not be in the cards for us. Instead, we poured our love and energy into our careers, our home, our travels, and each other. Or so I thought. That Tuesday, I had taken a rare day off work. The migraine that had been threatening since the weekend had finally hit full force, leaving me nauseous and sensitive to light. I'd spent most of the morning in our darkened bedroom, emerging only when the pain medication finally took effect. As I made my way downstairs to make some tea, I heard the distinct ping of Richard's phone receiving a text message. He'd left, in such a hurry that morning that he'd forgotten his personal phone, something that had never happened before. Richard was meticulous about his possessions, especially his phones. He carried 2, one for work and one for personal use. The work phone was sacred and untouchable due to client confidentiality. The personal phone was usually glued to his hand. I wasn't the type of wife who snooped through her husband's belongings. In 12 years of marriage, I had never once felt the need to check his messages or emails. Trust was the foundation of our relationship, at least that's what I believed. But something about that ping triggered an unfamiliar sensation in my gut. Call it intuition or just random curiosity, but I found myself walking over to where his phone lay on the kitchen counter. The screen had lit up with a preview of the message. Lily has a fever. Don't worry, nothing serious, but she's asking for her daddy. Any chance you can come home early? Love, A. I stared at those words, reading them over and over again as though they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Lily, daddy, home early, love, A. My first thought was that someone had texted the wrong number, but the message was there on Richard's phone, and the contact name at the top read Ava, with a small heart emoji beside it. With trembling fingers, I picked up the phone. It required a passcode, a 6-digit number I had never needed to know before. I tried our anniversary, 0615-0. The phone remained locked. I tried Richard's birthday, year wait 2979. Nothing. My birthday, 11/24/80, still locked. I set the phone down, my mind racing. There had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps it was a colleague with a sick child who had accidentally texted Richard instead of her husband. Maybe Richard was mentoring someone's daughter through the firm's community outreach program. Maybe. But none of those explanations accounted for the love, A, or the heart emoji. I made my tea and carried it to the living room, Richard's phone clutched in my other hand as though it were a ticking bomb. For the next hour, I tried every combination of numbers I could think of. The last 4 digits of our home phone, the street number of his office, the year we met. Nothing worked. Just as I was about to give up, another message came through, visible on the lock screen. She's asking if you'll read her favorite bedtime story tonight, the one about the princess and the dragon. Something cold and heavy settled in my stomach. I found myself walking back to the kitchen, opening the drawer where we kept miscellaneous items, and pulling out a small notepad. I wrote down the two messages word for word, including the timestamps. Then I placed Richard's phone exactly where I had found it and went back to our bedroom. For the rest of the day, I moved through the house like a ghost, touching surfaces, looking at photographs, examining the life Richard and I had built together through new, suspicious eyes. Had it all been a lie? Was I missing something obvious? Had there been signs I'd ignored? By the time I heard Richard's key in the lock that evening, I had composed myself enough to greet him with my usual kiss. But something must have shown on my face because he immediately asked if my migraine had gotten worse. "No, it's better," I replied, searching his face for… what? Guilt? Deceit? All I saw was the same Richard I'd known for 15 years, handsome in his tailored suit, with strands of silver just beginning to appear at his temples. His blue eyes looked tired but lit up when they met mine. He smelled of the same cologne he'd worn since we met, with undertones of coffee and the leather interior of his car. "You forgot your phone this morning," I said casually, nodding toward the counter where it still lay. "Did I?" He seemed genuinely surprised as he walked over to retrieve it. "That's not like me. Thanks for keeping it safe." He checked it right. In front of me, his expression betraying nothing as he presumably read the messages about Lily and her fever. He typed something quickly, a response to those messages, before slipping the phone into his pocket. "How was your dinner with Lisa?" he asked, his expression relaxed and happy. The hotel room visible behind him looked authentic enough, but I now wondered if he had merely stopped there to make this call before returning to Ava and Lily. "It was nice," I lied smoothly. "We tried that new Italian place on Newberry Street. The pasta was excellent." "That's great. Wish I could have joined you." He smiled, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I had always found endearing. "The meetings went well today. We're making progress with Morrison. I should be home on schedule tomorrow night." Home. The word landed differently now. Which home did he consider real? The Victorian in Boston with me? Or the brownstone in Chicago with his other family? "I'll pick you up at the airport," I offered, maintaining our normal routine. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I can grab a cab. My flight gets in late." "I don't mind," I insisted, wanting to observe his transition from Chicago Richard back to Boston Richard. "It'll give us a chance to catch up," he conceded with a warm smile. "You're the best. You know that? I don't deserve you." On that point, at least, we could agree. After exchanging the usual endearments and disconnecting, I received a final update from Amanda for the day. Subject returned to Lincoln Park residence after call. "Will continue surveillance tomorrow, including subject's departure for Boston. Full report with all documentation to be delivered Thursday." I thanked her and began preparing for Richard's return. Every detail needed to appear normal. Nothing could alert him to my discoveries or the storm that was brewing. I would play the role of devoted wife for a little while longer while I finalized my plans. The question that kept returning to me as I moved through the house was, which woman was Richard really betraying? Was I his true wife, with Ava serving as his Chicago fantasy? Or was Ava his authentic partner, with me functioning as a convenient Boston business arrangement? Perhaps he had compartmentalized so effectively that both relationships felt genuine to him in their separate contexts. The thought provided no comfort. Whether I was his primary or secondary wife made little difference to the magnitude of his deception. The years of lies, the systematic diversion of our shared resources, the careful maintenance of two distinct lives, these betrayals transcended any hierarchy of relationships. As I finally prepared for bed, a new determination settled over me. Richard's Chicago life had clearly brought him joy and fulfillment that he had kept hidden from me. In my revenge, I would ensure that he lost not just one life, but both. All the happiness he had stolen and hoarded for himself would be systematically dismantled until he was left with nothing but the consequences of his actions. Cold? Perhaps. But Richard's betrayal had left Frost in places where warmth once lived, and in the winter he had created, I would become the storm. Chapter 5: Two Lives. Colliding on Wednesday evening, I stood in the arrivals area of Boston Logan Airport, watching passengers emerge from Richard's Chicago flight. Amanda had confirmed that he had kissed Ava and Lily goodbye at their home that morning, taken a cab to his hotel to retrieve his luggage, and proceeded to the airport as planned. When Richard appeared, rolling his carry-on suitcase and looking slightly tired but content, I studied him with new eyes. This man coming toward me with a warm smile had just left his other wife and child hundreds of miles away. How did he manage the emotional transition? Was there a moment on the plane when he mentally shed one identity and assumed another? "There's my beautiful wife," he said, embracing me with what felt like genuine affection. He smelled faintly of unfamiliar cologne, something he must have applied in Chicago and hadn't completely faded during his journey. "Welcome home," I replied, accepting his kiss and taking his briefcase as we walked toward the parking garage. "Successful trip?" "Very." He launched into details about the Morrison merger, his tone animated as he described the negotiations and the personalities involved. To anyone observing us, we would have appeared to be exactly what we claimed to be: a happily married professional couple, reuniting after a brief separation. As we drove home, Richard asked about my days without him, and I provided carefully curated highlights that revealed nothing of my actual activities. When we arrived home, he commented on the fresh flowers in the entryway, a touch I had added, deliberately to maintain normalcy. "You always think of everything," he said, trailing a finger along a lily petal. The irony of his chosen flower wasn't lost on me. That night, Richard initiated intimacy, something that had become less frequent in recent years, but still occurred regularly enough to maintain the appearance of a healthy marriage. I found myself watching his expressions, wondering if he touched Ava the same way, if he whispered the same endearments in her ear. The thought should have disgusted me, should have made physical contact with him unbearable. Instead, I found myself detached, almost clinical in my observations. This wasn't my husband making love to me. This was a research subject whose patterns and behaviors I was documenting for future reference. Afterward, as Richard drifted to sleep beside me, I lay awake planning the next phase of my investigation. Amanda's complete report would arrive tomorrow, providing me with comprehensive documentation of Richard's Chicago life. My first appointment with a divorce attorney, Patricia Winters, reputed to be the most aggressive matrimonial lawyer in Massachusetts, was scheduled for Friday morning. The pieces were falling into place, but I still needed more information before deciding on my exact course of action. Specifically, I needed to understand the full extent of Richard's financial deception and whether Ava was aware of my existence. Thursday morning, Richard left for work with a lingering kiss and a promise to be home for dinner. "Let's go out," he suggested. "That new place on Charles Street you've been wanting to try." I agreed, thinking it might be one of our last meals together before I set my plans in motion. Once he had departed, I checked my secure email and found Amanda's promised report. 68 pages of detailed information, photographs, and background research on Richard's Chicago life. The report confirmed much of what I had already discovered, while adding crucial new details. 1. Richard and Ava's marriage appeared to be legal and registered in Cook County, Illinois. This raised serious questions about how he had circumvented the system, as Illinois required a declaration of marital status, and both parties needed to appear in person for the license. 2. Lily was indeed their biological daughter, born April 17, 7 years ago. Her birth certificate listed Richard as her father. 3. Richard maintained a separate checking account in Chicago under his own name, into which he deposited the funds withdrawn from our joint investment account. This account paid the mortgage, Lily's school tuition, and household expenses for the Chicago family. 4. Property records showed that beyond the Lincoln Park house, Richard and Ava jointly owned a small vacation cottage on Lake Michigan, purchased 5 years ago. 5. Richard's pattern of travel between Boston and Chicago had been consistent for the past 8 years, approximately 1 week per month in Chicago, always with business-related reasons provided to me. 6. Most significantly, Amanda had managed to obtain information suggesting that Ava believed Richard was divorced from a previous wife in Boston. Conversations overheard between the couple indicated that Ava thought Richard's frequent Boston trips were purely for business purposes, maintaining client relationships from his previous practice. This last detail was particularly illuminating. If accurate, it meant that Ava was another victim in Richard's elaborate deception, not a knowing participant. She believed she was his only current wife, just as I had until a few days ago. The report included dozens of photographs documenting Richard's movements in Chicago, his interactions with Ava and Lily, their home, and various documents Amanda had managed to access. There was also a USB drive containing video footage of Richard at the piano recital and playing in the park with Lily. I spent hours reviewing every page, every image, every detail of this parallel life Richard had constructed. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. My husband of 12 years was also someone else's husband of 8 years. He had fathered a child with another woman while continuing to console me over our inability to conceive. He had systematically diverted our shared resources to support this second household, and he had lied, repeatedly, convincingly, without apparent remorse or hesitation, to both of the women who called him husband. By the time I finished reviewing Amanda's report, my initial shock had hardened into cold resolution. Richard deserved to lose everything he had built on the foundation of these lies. Both his Boston life and his Chicago life would crumble, leaving him with nothing but the consequences of his duplicity. But the revelation about Ava's apparent ignorance complicated matters. If she truly believed Richard was divorced and legitimately her husband, then she was as much a victim as I was. Lily obviously was entirely innocent, a child who loved her father and would be devastated by his exposure. My revenge needed to punish Richard while minimizing collateral damage to Ava, and especially Lily. This would require a more nuanced approach than simply exposing his bigamy and watching his world implode. With this in mind, I prepared for my appointment with Patricia Winters the following morning. I organized Amanda's report and my own evidence file into a comprehensive dossier that documented every aspect of Richard's double life. I also gathered our financial records, property documents, and investment statements to provide a complete picture of our marital assets, both those I knew about and those Richard had hidden. That evening, Richard took me to dinner as promised. The restaurant was elegant and intimate, with flickering candles and soft music creating a romantic atmosphere. Richard was attentive and charming, complimenting my appearance and sharing amusing anecdotes from his Chicago trip, carefully edited, of course, to exclude any mention of Ava or Lily. "I've been thinking," he said as we lingered over dessert, "we should plan a real vacation soon. Maybe Europe in the fall? Italy, perhaps?" I smiled, marveling at his audacity. Was he making similar plans with Ava? Or did he schedule his vacations carefully, alternating between wives to avoid conflicts? "That sounds wonderful," I replied, matching his enthusiasm. "I've always wanted to see Venice." "Venice it is," he declared, raising his wine glass in a toast. "To future adventures together." I clinked my glass against his, thinking that our most significant adventure would begin much sooner than he anticipated. "To the future," I echoed, maintaining my smile as I imagined the shock that awaited him. As we drove home, Richard reached over to take my hand, his thumb caressing my wedding ring. "Thank you for being so understanding about all my travel lately," he said. "I know it's not easy having me away so often." "We do what we must for our careers," I responded neutrally. "I understand the demands of your position." He squeezed my hand appreciatively. "That's one of the things I love most about you. Your independence. You have your own life, your own interests. Some women would be constantly checking up on their husbands, demanding to know every detail of their day." Was this how he justified his betrayal to himself? By casting my trust and respect for his privacy as convenient independence that facilitated his deception. "Trust is important in a marriage," I said, watching his face carefully. "Without it, what do you really have?" Something flickered in his eyes, a moment of discomfort quickly masked. "Absolutely," he agreed, returning his attention to the road. "Trust and honest communication. That's our foundation." I turned to look out the window, hiding the cold smile that rose to my lips. Our foundation was about to crumble beneath his feet, and he had no idea the earthquake was already in motion. When we arrived home, Richard suggested opening a bottle of wine and continuing our evening on the patio. I declined, claiming an early client meeting the next morning, which wasn't entirely untrue, as Patricia Winters was indeed a potential client of sorts. "Rain check?" he asked, kissing my forehead. "Maybe tomorrow night?" "Definitely," I promised, knowing that by tomorrow night, our relationship would be irrevocably altered. As Richard showered, I made final preparations for the following day. I secured copies of Amanda's report and my evidence file in a safe deposit box I had recently opened at a bank different from the one Richard and I used. I confirmed my appointment with Patricia Winters and made sure the information packet I had prepared was complete and organized. Then I laid out my clothes for the morning, a tailored navy suit that projected confidence and authority, and selected jewelry that had no sentimental connection to Richard. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of my liberation from the lies that had defined my marriage, and I would dress accordingly. Before going to bed, I sent a brief message to Amanda, thanking her for her thorough investigation and requesting that she remain available for potential follow-up work. Her response was equally concise. "Standing by. Good luck tomorrow." That night, I slept better than I had since discovering Richard's text messages. The uncertainty had been the most agonizing part. The questions, the doubts, the desperate search for explanations that could preserve some fragment of the life I thought I had. Now that I possessed the full truth, as ugly as it was, I could proceed with clarity and purpose. Richard might have mastered the art of living two separate lives, but I was about to demonstrate mastery of a different skill, dismantling those lives with surgical precision while ensuring he felt every cut. Chapter 6. The Legal Stratagem. Patricia Winters' office occupied the top floor of a sleek building in downtown Boston, offering panoramic views of the harbor. The reception area featured minimalist furnishings, abstract art, and fresh orchids, an environment that radiated both success and intimidation. I was ushered into a conference room precisely at 9 o'clock, where Patricia awaited me. She was a tall, slender woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. Her charcoal suit was impeccably tailored, and she wore a single piece of jewelry, a diamond pendant that caught the light when she moved. "Eleanor Blackwood," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, her gaze direct and assessing. "Please, have a seat. I understand you're exploring divorce options under rather unusual circumstances." I settled across from her, placing my evidence binder on the polished table between us. "Unusual is an understatement, Ms. Winters. My husband has been leading a double life for at least 8 years, including a second marriage and a child." If she was surprised, she didn't show it. Instead, she opened a leather portfolio and uncapped an expensive-looking pen. "Why don't you start from the beginning? And please call me Patricia. For the next hour, I methodically presented the evidence of Richard's deception: the text messages that had first alerted me, the financial trails, Amanda's investigation results, and the photographic evidence of his Chicago family. I maintained a composed, almost clinical tone throughout, presenting facts rather than emotions. Patricia listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly taking detailed notes. When I finished, she closed her portfolio and leaned back in her chair, studying me with new respect. In 27 years of practicing matrimonial law, I've encountered bigamy exactly 3 times, she said. But I've never seen a case documented as thoroughly as yours. Most spouses in your position would have confronted their partners immediately, often with minimal evidence and maximum emotion. That approach wouldn't serve my interests, I replied. I need to understand all my options before making any moves. She nodded approvingly. Good. Emotion is the enemy of effective strategy in these situations. She tapped my evidence binder. Based on what you've presented, we have several potential avenues. The most obvious is a divorce action citing fraud and financial malfeasance, combined with a criminal complaint for bigamy. What would that look like in practical terms? Bigamy is a felony in Massachusetts, punishable by up to 5 years in state prison and substantial fines. Given the duration of the deception and the financial aspects, Richard would likely face serious jail time. She paused, watching my reaction. Is that what you want? To see your husband imprisoned? I considered the question carefully. I want him to face consequences proportional to his actions, but I'm more concerned with protecting my financial interests and ensuring that his other family, particularly his daughter, doesn't suffer unnecessarily for his crimes. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. That's a more nuanced approach than most clients initially take. Let me outline some options that might better align with those goals. She proceeded to sketch out several potential strategies, ranging from full criminal prosecution to purely civil remedies. The most compelling was what she called a controlled demolition approach. Instead of immediately exposing the bigamy, to authorities, we file for divorce citing irreconcilable differences, nothing that would alert Richard that you know about his Chicago life. Simultaneously, we use discovery procedures to force full financial disclosure, including any accounts or properties he's hidden. She leaned forward, warming to her subject. Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state, not a community property state. This means the court divides marital assets equitably, not necessarily equally. When fraud is involved, judges typically award the innocent spouse a larger percentage of assets. How much larger? I asked. In cases involving significant deception like yours, I've seen awards of up to 75 or even 80% of marital assets to the wronged spouse. Additionally, if we can prove that Richard diverted joint funds to support his Chicago family, the court can order him to reimburse those amounts with interest. This approach appealed to my sense of justice. And the criminal aspects? Patricia tapped her pen against her portfolio. Here's where strategic timing becomes crucial. We hold the bigamy evidence in reserve, using it as leverage during settlement negotiations. Richard will be motivated to agree to generous terms to avoid criminal charges that could destroy his legal career and potentially send him to prison. Would that be legal? Isn't that essentially blackmail? She smiled thinly. It's walking a fine line, certainly. But there's nothing illegal about informing someone that you possess evidence of their criminal activity and are prepared to share it with authorities. The key is how we frame the discussion. I nodded, appreciating the distinction. And what about Ava and Lily? According to our investigator, Ava believes she's Richard's only current wife. That complicates matters emotionally but not legally, Patricia responded. If Ava truly doesn't know about you, she's another victim of Richard's deception. The Illinois marriage would be void from inception since Richard was legally married to you at the time. However, Lily would still be entitled to child support as Richard's biological daughter. She paused, tapping her pen thoughtfully. I assume you'd want Ava to eventually know the truth? Yes, but carefully. She shouldn't learn about it through court filings or police involvement if possible. She deserves to make her own informed decisions about how to proceed. Patricia studied me for a moment. Most clients in your position would want to punish both the husband and the other woman. Your compassion for Ava is unusual. I shrugged slightly. We're both victims of the same man's lies. Directing my anger at her would be misplacing it. A remarkably balanced perspective, she commented. In that case, I would suggest a phased approach. First, we secure your financial position through the divorce proceedings. Then, once settlement terms are established, you can decide how to approach Ava with the truth, either directly or through an intermediary. The strategy made sense, aligning with my desire for a calculated response rather than an emotional reaction. What timeline are we looking at for this approach? Patricia considered. For the divorce itself, Massachusetts has a mandatory 90-day waiting period after filing before a judgment can be entered. Realistically, given the financial complexity and Richard's likely resistance once he realizes you're serious, we're looking at 6 to 8 months minimum for a completed divorce. And the financial protections? How quickly can those be put in place? We can file for temporary orders immediately upon serving Richard with divorce papers. These would freeze major assets and establish temporary support if needed. I'd also recommend taking proactive steps before filing, moving your personal portion of joint funds to separate accounts, securing valuable personal items, and documenting the contents of safe deposit boxes. I nodded, having already begun some of these protective measures. What about Richard's law firm? Would they be notified of the divorce proceedings? Not automatically, but divorce filings are public records. If we proceed with the irreconcilable differences approach initially, there's nothing that would specifically alert his professional colleagues. However, if criminal charges eventually come into play, the firm would certainly become aware. I absorb this information, mentally adjusting my timeline. I'd like to move forward with the strategy you've outlined. How soon can we begin the process? Patricia smiled, a sharp, determined expression that suggested she relished the challenge ahead. I can have divorce papers prepared within a week. In the meantime, you should follow the financial protection plan I'll provide today. She slid a folder across the table. This outlines immediate steps to secure your assets before Richard becomes aware of your intentions. We spent the next hour reviewing specific details, which accounts needed to be separated, how to document valuable possessions, and the importance of gathering additional financial records Richard might try to conceal once served with divorce papers. By the time our meeting concluded, I had a comprehensive plan and timeline for dismantling my marriage while maximizing both financial recovery and Richard's accountability. Patricia would prepare the initial divorce filing while I implemented the asset protection measures we had discussed. One last question, I said as we wrapped up. How do your clients typically handle the emotional aspect of cases like this? The shock, the betrayal? Patricia's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her professional armor. Everyone processes differently. Some throw themselves into the legal battle as a distraction. Others seek therapy or support groups. She paused, studying me. But based on my observation, you seem to have an unusual capacity for compartmentalization, similar to what your husband must possess to have maintained his double life for so long. The comparison should have offended me, but I recognized its accuracy. There's a difference, I pointed out. I'm compartmentalizing to survive a betrayal. He did it to perpetrate one. She inclined her head, acknowledging the distinction. Fair enough. Still, don't discount the emotional impact this will have, even on someone with your self-control. When you confront Richard, when you see his life unraveling, when you finally tell Ava the truth, these moments will test you in ways you can't fully anticipate. I'll be prepared, I assured her, gathering my materials. Patricia's smile held a hint of skepticism. No one ever is, not really. But that's what makes these cases so fascinating from my perspective, watching how people react when their carefully constructed realities collapse. As I left her office, that observation lingered with me. Patricia was right about one thing. No matter how thoroughly I planned my revenge, the human elements remained unpredictable. Richard's reaction, Ava's response, even my own emotions, as events unfolded, all represented variables that couldn't be fully controlled. But unlike Richard, who had built his dual life on deception and wishful thinking, my approach was grounded in hard evidence and legal strategy. His house of cards would fall because it had always been unsustainable. My role was simply to introduce the inevitable wind. Back in my car, I reviewed the financial protection plan Patricia had provided. Most of the recommendations were straightforward: document all assets, secure important papers, transfer my portion of joint funds to new accounts at different banks, and inventory valuable possessions with photographs and appraisals where possible. I spent the remainder of the day implementing these measures, visiting banks to open new accounts, photographing our home's contents, and gathering additional financial documents from our safe. By evening, I had completed most of the immediate protective steps Patricia had advised. Richard called mid-afternoon to check in, mentioning he might be late for dinner due to a case development. I assured him it was fine, that I had plenty to keep me occupied. The ease with which we continued our normal interactions still unsettled me, even as I methodically prepared to dismantle our life together. When he finally arrived home around 8, he looked tired but satisfied, the expression of a man who believed he was managing his complicated life successfully. If only he knew how thoroughly his deception had been uncovered, how completely his control was about to be wrested away. "Productive day?" I asked as we sat down to the simple dinner I had prepared. "Very," he replied, reaching for the wine. "The Morrison case is finally coming together. And yours?" I smiled, the truth hidden behind careful phrasing. "Extremely productive. I made some decisions I've been postponing for too long." "That's my girl," he said approvingly, raising his glass in a small toast. "Always moving forward." I clinked my glass against his, thinking, "You have no idea how forward I'm about to move, or how thoroughly I'm leaving you behind." Chapter 7. The Financial Fortress. Over the next week, I constructed a financial fortress around my assets, while Patricia prepared the divorce filing. Following her guidance, I methodically separated my financial life from Richard's in ways that would be difficult for him to detect before I was ready to reveal my knowledge. First, I transferred my personal inheritance, money from my grandparents that had always been kept separate from our marital assets, from our joint investment manager to a new account with a different firm. This represented a substantial sum that had fortunately remained untouched by Richard's diversion of funds to his Chicago family. Next, I moved half of our joint checking and savings account balances to newly established accounts in my name, only at a different bank. This was legally permitted as we were still married, and the amounts represented my fair share of our liquid assets. I left detailed accounting records of these transfers in my secure file, documenting that I had taken only what could reasonably be considered mine. I also consulted with a forensic accountant recommended by Patricia, providing him with all our financial records for the past decade. His task was to trace every dollar Richard had diverted to his Chicago life, creating a comprehensive report that could be used in divorce proceedings to claim reimbursement with interest. Throughout these preparations, I maintained absolute normalcy in my interactions with Richard. We continued our usual routines: morning coffee together before work, occasional text messages during the day, dinner conversations about our respective professional challenges. I even initiated intimacy one evening, finding a strange power in knowing I was choosing to be with him while fully aware of his betrayal. Richard noticed nothing amiss. His confidence in his ability to compartmentalize his two lives had made him complacent, unable to imagine that his careful deception could be discovered, much less countered with equal calculation. By Friday, Patricia informed me that the divorce papers were ready and could be served at my discretion. The petition cites irreconcilable differences as requested, she explained during our phone call. Nothing that would signal your knowledge of the bigamy. How would you like to proceed with service? I considered the options. Having Richard served at his office would create immediate professional embarrassment, but it might also alert him prematurely to challenge the financial moves I had made. Having him served at home would provide privacy but might make it easier for him to hide his reaction and begin formulating countermeasures. Let's have him served at home, I decided. Sunday morning, he usually reads the paper in his study until about 11. That would give me time to be visibly absent, perhaps at the gym, while ensuring he has privacy to absorb the initial shock. Excellent thinking, Patricia approved. I'll arrange for the process server. Will you want to be present for the aftermath, or would you prefer to return later? I'll return later, I determined. I want him to have time to read everything thoroughly before we speak. That way, he can't claim any misunderstandings. With the plans set, I spent Saturday making final preparations. I packed essential items, clothing, personal documents, irreplaceable mementos, into suitcases and stored them in the trunk of my car, ready for a quick departure if necessary. I didn't anticipate physical danger from Richard, but I wanted the option to leave immediately if the confrontation became too intense. I also prepared a separate file containing copies of key evidence about Richard's Chicago life, not the complete documentation, but enough to make it clear that I knew everything. This would be my tactical weapon during our inevitable confrontation. That evening, Richard suggested we watch a movie together, one of our weekend rituals from earlier in our marriage that had become less frequent as our careers demanded more time. I agreed, sensing a certain poignancy in this final normal evening, before everything changed. We settled on the couch with wine and the period drama Richard had selected. As the story unfolded on screen, ironically, a tale about deception and hidden identities in Victorian England, Richard draped his arm around my shoulders, pulling me closer. "We should do this more often," he murmured, kissing my temple. "I miss our quiet evenings together." I made a non-committal sound, wondering how he reconciled such sentiments with his division of time between two wives. Did he say similar things to Ava during his Chicago weeks? Did he feel genuine affection for both of us, or was one relationship more authentic than the other? These questions had occupied my thoughts increasingly as my anger evolved into something more complex. The initial shock and rage had settled into a cold, analytical determination that sought not just retribution, but understanding. I wanted to comprehend how Richard's mind worked, how he justified his actions, how he managed the emotional and practical complexities of his dual existence. Perhaps tomorrow, when the careful facade finally cracked, I would begin to get answers. When? We went to bed that night. I lay awake long after Richard's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of sleep. I studied his face in the dim light filtering through the curtains, the face I had loved and trusted for 15 years. Tomorrow, that face would transform as he realized his careful deception had been discovered. Tomorrow, the man beside me would become a stranger in truth as well as in fact. I felt an unexpected pang of grief for what might have been, for the genuine partnership I had believed we shared, for the future we had planned together, for the love I had thought was real. But I pushed these feelings aside, focusing instead on the vindication that awaited me. Richard had stolen years of my life through his lies. Tomorrow, I would begin reclaiming my future on my own terms. Sunday morning arrived with perfect spring weather, sunshine streaming through the windows, birds singing in the cherry trees outside, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass from neighboring lawns. I rose early, dressed in workout clothes, and prepared breakfast as usual. Richard joined me around 8, pouring coffee and commenting on the beautiful day. "Perfect weather for gardening," he observed. "I thought I might tackle those flower beds this afternoon." I smiled, knowing his plans would soon change dramatically. Sounds nice. I'm heading to the gym for a few hours. Yoga class, then maybe some weights. Good for you, he approved, reaching for the Sunday paper. I'll hold down the fort here. Maybe make that pasta dish you like for dinner? Perfect, I agreed, gathering my gym bag. I leaned down to kiss his cheek, a gesture that felt surreal, given what was about to happen. See you around noon. I drove to the gym but didn't go inside. Instead, I parked where I could observe the entrance to our street and called Patricia to confirm the process server was on schedule. Right on time, she assured me. Should be arriving at your house within 15 minutes. I thanked her and settled in to wait, feeling strangely calm. After a week of intense preparation and months of suspicion before that, the moment of truth was finally approaching. Soon, Richard would know that his elaborate deception had been discovered. Soon, the power dynamic that had silently defined our marriage, his knowledge versus my ignorance, would be reversed. At exactly 10:45, I observed the process server's car turning onto our street. I gave him 20 minutes to complete his task before calling Patricia again. Papers delivered successfully, she confirmed. Your husband accepted service personally. The server reported that he appeared confused, but not hostile. Confused would be just the beginning, I thought. Thanks, you, Patricia. I'll proceed as planned and contact you tomorrow with an update. I waited another hour before driving home, giving Richard ample time to read the divorce petition and supporting documents. As I pulled into our driveway, I noted that his car was still there. He hadn't fled in panic or anger. The house looked peaceful from the outside, offering no hint of the drama unfolding within. Taking a deep breath, I collected my gym bag and entered through the front door. Richard? I called, my voice steady. I'm home. No response. I moved through the house, finally locating him in his study. He sat at his desk, the divorce papers spread before him, his expression a complex mixture of shock, confusion, and calculation. He looked up as I appeared in the doorway, his eyes searching my face. Eleanor, he said, his voice surprisingly composed. I think we need to talk about this misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. Of course, that would be his opening move, to suggest that this was all a terrible error, a hasty decision on my part that could be smoothed over with reasonable discussion. I leaned against the doorframe, maintaining physical distance between us. There's no misunderstanding, Richard. I'm filing for divorce. The papers are quite clear. He stood, spreading his hands in a conciliatory gesture. But why? What's prompted this? We were just watching a movie together last night, planning dinner for tonight. If you've been unhappy, why haven't you said anything? I almost admired his performance. The reasonable husband blindsided by an inexplicable divorce action. If I didn't know better, his bewilderment might have seemed genuine. I've been doing a lot of thinking, I replied calmly. About our marriage, our future, and what I want for the next chapter of my life. I've concluded that this relationship no longer serves my best interests. Richard's expression shifted, confusion giving way to concern tinged with calculation. He moved toward me, stopping when I subtly stepped back. Eleanor, this isn't like you. Such a cold assessment. Such finality. Whatever problems you think we have, we can work through them together. We always have. He attempted a reassuring smile that didn't reach his eyes. 15 years together deserves more than this, doesn't it? For a moment, I was tempted to end the charade immediately, to throw his Chicago life in his face and watch his careful composure shatter. But patience had gotten me this far. I would let him continue this facade a while longer, gathering insights into his methods of manipulation. 15 years is indeed a significant investment, I acknowledged, which is why I've given this considerable thought. This isn't an impulsive decision, Richard. He shifted tactics, moving back to sit on the edge of his desk, creating an impression of casual confidence. "Is there someone else? Have you met another man?" The irony was almost laughable. "No, Richard, there's no one else in my was your day?" I asked, maintaining the facade of normalcy while my heart hammered in my chest. "The usual chaos," he replied with a tired smile. "The Morrison merger is getting complicated. I might have to fly to Chicago next week." Chicago. My mind instantly latched onto this detail. Was that where they were? This Ava and Lily? For how long? I kept my voice even, years of negotiating with difficult clients coming in handy. "Just 2 or 3 days. I'll know more tomorrow." He loosened his tie and headed for the stairs. "I'm going to grab a quick shower before dinner." As he disappeared, upstairs, I stood motionless in the kitchen, trying to process what had just happened. Or rather, what hadn't happened. There had been no confession, no suspicious behavior, no obvious lies I could detect. Just my husband of 12 years acting, exactly like the man I thought I knew. But those messages hadn't been meant for me. There was a Lily somewhere who called Richard Daddy. There was an Ava who signed her messages with love. I needed proof. I needed facts. Most of all, I needed the truth. Little did I know that my quest for answers would uncover a deception so elaborate, so carefully constructed, that it would shatter not just my marriage, but my entire understanding of the man I had loved for 15 years. And little did Richard know that his betrayal had awakened something in me that had been dormant for years, a cold, calculating determination that would ultimately be his undoing. As Richard showered upstairs, humming the same Beatles tune he always hummed in the shower, I made a decision. I would not confront him with suspicions and half-truths. I would not give him the chance to construct more lies. I would investigate methodically and thoroughly, gathering irrefutable evidence before making my next move. And so began the most painful and revealing chapter of my life, one that would eventually lead me down a path of revenge so meticulous and devastating that it would change us both forever. Chapter 2. The investigation begins. The next morning, I woke up before Richard and watched him sleep. In repose, his face looked peaceful, even innocent, the same face I'd woken up next to for more than a decade. Was this the face of a man living a double life? I studied the familiar contours, the slight frown that appeared even in sleep, the way his eyelashes fluttered as he dreamed. What was he dreaming about? Or perhaps the better question was, who? After he left for work, promising to text me details about his potential Chicago trip, I called my office and requested the rest of the week off, citing family issues. It wasn't a complete lie. If my suspicions were correct, I had family issues of seismic proportions. I began my investigation with Richard's home office, a space I rarely entered out of respect for his privacy and the confidential nature of his work. The room was immaculate, as always. Law books lined the built-in shelves, family photographs adorned his desk, and his diplomas hung proudly on the wall. Everything seemed so normal, so consistent with the Richard I knew. His desk drawers were unlocked, containing nothing more suspicious than paper clips, sticky notes, and a half-eaten packet of mints. His filing cabinet held neatly labeled folders of household documents, mortgage papers, insurance policies, car maintenance records, and tax returns. For a moment, I felt a wave of shame. What was I doing? Searching my husband's office like a detective? What had happened to trust and respect, the values we'd always held sacred in our marriage? But then I remembered those text messages. Lily has a fever. She's asking for her daddy. I continued my search, more determined than ever. In the closet, behind a row of file boxes labeled by year, I found a smaller box that seemed out of place. It wasn't labeled, and unlike the others, it was sealed with packing tape. I carefully cut open the tape and lifted the lid. Inside were Financial documents, older ones from about 6 to 7 years ago. Most were unremarkable. Old bank statements, investment reports, and receipts. But buried among them was something that made my blood run cold. A lease agreement for an apartment in Brookline, a nearby suburb. The lease was in Richard's name, dated 7 years ago, for a 2-bedroom apartment on Beacon Street. We had never lived in Brookline. We had never rented an apartment on Beacon Street. With trembling hands, I took a photo of the document with my phone and continued digging. There was nothing else related to this apartment in the box. No utility bills, no further lease renewals. Just this single piece of paper that raised more questions than it answered. Had Richard rented an apartment for someone else? Had he briefly maintained a separate residence for some reason? The lease predated the text messages about Lily by several years, but it was the first concrete evidence that there might be aspects of Richard's life hidden from me. I carefully repacked the box, resealed it with the tape, and returned it to its position in the closet. Then I sat at his desk, opened my phone, and created a secure note where I could document my findings. I titled it simply, Evidence. Item 1. Text messages about Lily and her fever, signed by Ava with a heart emoji. Item 2. Lease agreement for an apartment in Brookline, dated 7 years ago. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The investigator in me, the part that had excelled at analyzing complex financial data for high-stakes corporate clients, was now fully awake and focused on this most personal of mysteries. My next step was to access our financial records. As a financial consultant, I had always managed our investments, but Richard handled the day-to-day banking. We maintained separate checking accounts for personal expenses while sharing joint accounts for household costs. This arrangement had always seemed practical given our busy careers and independent spending habits. Now I wondered if it had served another purpose entirely. I logged into our joint accounts first, scanning the last several years of statements. Nothing unusual stood out at first glance. Our mortgage payments, utility bills, insurance premiums, and shared credit card payments all appeared regular and expected. Then I moved on to the credit card statements. Richard and I each had our own credit cards, but we could view each other's statements online. I had rarely bothered to look at his in detail, trusting that he managed his own expenses responsibly. Now I downloaded 3 years' worth of statements and began a methodical review. Most of the charges were mundane: lunches near his office, gas for his car, the occasional electronics purchase, clothing from his favorite stores. But as I examined the statements more carefully, patterns emerged. Every month there were charges from restaurants in neighborhoods we rarely visited. Many were on weeknights when Richard had claimed to be working late. There were also recurring charges to a toy store and a children's bookshop. The most revealing pattern appeared around holidays and certain dates. Each December showed significant charges at upscale jewelry stores, in addition to the gifts I had received. Each February had a charge from the same romantic restaurant, but not on Valentine's Day, which he always spent with me. Instead, these charges appeared on February 8th, year after year. And then there were the 3 dates that showed similar patterns of special purchases: April 17th, August 3rd, and November 12th. These dates meant nothing to me, but clearly they were significant to Richard. I added these patterns to my evidence note, along with specific examples of charges that seemed suspicious. Then I turned to his travel history. Richard traveled frequently for work, at least once a month, sometimes more. I had never questioned these trips, as they aligned with the cases he discussed and the clients he mentioned. Now I pulled up his calendar for the past year and cross-referenced it with his credit card charges during travel periods. Most trips showed the expected patterns: hotel charges in the city he was supposedly visiting, meals at restaurants near the hotel or client, offices, perhaps some in-room movies or minibar charges. But several trips stood out. 1. A supposed conference in San Francisco where his credit card showed charges in Chicago. 2. A client meeting in Washington, D.C. that coincided with charges at a children's hospital gift shop in Chicago. 3. Multiple overnight trips where there were no hotel charges at all. Chicago, the same city he had mentioned possibly visiting next week. I felt sick to my stomach, but forced myself to continue. I pulled up our joint investment account, which we had established, for major expenses and our eventual retirement. The balance was healthy, but slightly lower than I had expected based on our contributions and the market performance. I downloaded the transaction history and discovered a series of withdrawals, $10,000 every 6 months, dating back 7 years. Each withdrawal had been authorized by Richard, using the electronic signature option that our investment firm offered. The money had been transferred to an account I didn't recognize. I added this information to my growing evidence file, a cold determination settling over me. Whatever Richard was hiding, it was substantial and long-standing. This wasn't a recent affair or a brief lapse in judgment. This was something much more calculated and deliberate. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Chicago trip confirmed for Monwed next week. Morrison wants to renegotiate terms in person. We'll book flight tonight. Sorry about the timing. Know you had that dinner with Lisa planned for Tuesday. I stared at the message, trying to reconcile this thoughtful husband who remembered my dinner plans with the man who had apparently been leading a second life for years. I replied with a casual, "No problem. Lisa will understand. Safe travels." Then I opened my laptop and began researching private investigators in the Boston area. By the end of the day, I had an appointment with Amanda Chen, a former FBI agent who now specialized in matrimonial investigations. Her reviews described her as thorough, discreet, and compassionate but unflinching. I would meet her tomorrow morning at a coffee shop far from my usual haunts. By then, I hoped to have more information, particularly about what Richard might be doing in Chicago. That night, I served Richard's favorite meal and poured us both generous glasses of wine. As we ate, I asked innocent questions about his upcoming trip and listened attentively as he elaborated on the complex merger he was handling. "The Chicago team is difficult to read," he said, swirling his wine. "Morrison thinks they're hiding something, but I'm not so sure. People often hold cards close to their chest during negotiations." I nodded sympathetically, thinking how well I understood that concept now. "Where do you usually stay when you're in Chicago?" I asked casually. "I've always wanted to visit. Maybe I could join you sometime when you're not so busy with clients." A brief flash of something, alarm, calculation, crossed his face before his expression settled back into its usual pleasant lines. "The Palmer House, usually. It's convenient to most of the financial district offices. And yes, you'd love Chicago. We should plan a proper trip there sometime, not when I'm working." I smiled and reached for his hand across the table. "I'd like that." Later, as Richard showered, I slipped into his home office again and checked his desk calendar. Unlike his electronic calendar that I had access to, this physical calendar sometimes contained additional notes or reminders. Sure enough, in the margin of next week's Chicago entry, there was a small notation. Elle's recital. 7 p.m. Tues? Elle Lilly? The sick child from the text messages? I took a photo with my phone, then hurried back to the kitchen just before Richard emerged from the bathroom. That night, as we lay in bed, Richard fell asleep quickly while I remained wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Next to me was a man I had loved and trusted for 15 years, a man who now seemed like a stranger. What else didn't I know about him? Who was he when he wasn't with me? And most importantly, what was I going to do about it? The answer came to me as I listened to Richard's steady breathing beside me. I would be patient. I would be thorough. I would uncover every aspect of his deception before deciding on my next move. And when I did move, it would be decisive and irrevocable. Richard had played a long game, maintaining his secret life while enjoying the benefits of our marriage. Well, I could play the long game too. And unlike Richard, I had nothing to hide and nothing to lose. My revenge would not be swift or emotional. It would be calculated, comprehensive, and cold. As cold as the heart that could sustain such an elaborate betrayal for so many years. With that resolution firmly in mind, I finally drifted off to sleep, dreaming of Chicago and a little girl named Lily who was waiting for her daddy to read her favorite bedtime story. Bye. Chapter 3. The Chicago Connection. Amanda Chen was exactly what her reviews had promised. Professional, direct, and unflappable. We met at a quiet corner table in a coffee shop in Cambridge, far enough from both our home and Richard's office, to avoid any chance encounters. She was a compact woman in her early 50s with short salt and pepper hair and keen eyes that missed nothing. She wore a simple charcoal pantsuit and minimal jewelry, just a wedding band and small stud earrings. After brief introductions, she got straight to business. "Tell me everything you know so far," she said, her voice low and steady. "Don't edit or interpret, just the facts as you've observed them." I recounted my discoveries, the text messages, the lease agreement, the credit card patterns, the investment withdrawals, and the Chicago connections. As I spoke, she took notes on a small pad, occasionally nodding but never interrupting. When I finished, she closed her notebook and looked at me directly. "Based on what you've shared, it sounds like your husband may be maintaining a second household. The regular withdrawals, the consistent date patterns, and especially the text messages strongly suggest an ongoing relationship with another woman and possibly a child." Hearing someone else say it out loud made it real in a way my private suspicions hadn't. I felt a sharp pain in my chest but forced myself to remain composed. "I need to know for certain," I said. "I need evidence that would stand up in court if necessary." Amanda nodded. "That's what I provide. Here's what I propose. Since your husband is traveling to Chicago next week, I'll follow him there. I'll document his movements, photograph any encounters, and gather information about this other household if it exists. My team can also perform background checks on any individuals he meets with regularly." "How much will this cost?" I asked. She named a figure that was substantial but not prohibitive, given my own income. "Half in advance, half upon delivery of my findings. I'll provide a comprehensive report with photographs, video when possible, and all relevant background information I uncover." I wrote her a check for the retainer without hesitation. "There's one more thing," I said. "If he is living a double life, I don't want to confront him immediately. I need time to process everything and make certain preparations." Something in my tone must have alerted her because her eyes narrowed slightly. "Ms. Blackwood, my job is to gather information, not to facilitate any actions that might be illegal or harmful." "I understand," I assured her. "I'm not planning anything illegal, but if Richard has been deceiving me for years, I want to be fully prepared before I confront him. That means securing my financial position and consulting with a divorce attorney, nothing more sinister than that." She seemed satisfied with my explanation. "In that case, I'm happy to proceed with discretion. I'll contact you only on this secure email address you've provided, and I won't take any actions that might alert your husband to the investigation." We finalized the details of her assignment. She would follow Richard from Boston to Chicago, monitor his activities throughout his stay, and document any meetings or visits to locations outside his stated business purpose. She would also begin gathering information on any Chicago addresses associated with him and run background checks on any names I had uncovered so far, primarily Ava, with a possible connection to a child named Lily. As we parted, Amanda offered a final observation. "In my experience, people who maintain double lives become very good at compartmentalizing. They convince themselves they're not really doing anything wrong as long as they keep their separate worlds from colliding. It's a form of moral gymnastics that allows them to look in the mirror each morning." I thought about Richard's apparent ability to come home to me each night, to share our bed, to make plans for our future, all while nurturing a separate existence elsewhere. That sounds like a special kind of sociopathy, I commented. Amanda shrugged. Perhaps, or just an extreme version of the little lies and omissions we all use to protect ourselves and others. The difference is one of scale and impact, not necessarily nature. Her words stayed with me as I drove home, making me question not just Richard's morality, but my own. If I pursued the cold, calculated revenge I was beginning to envision, would I be any better than him? The difference, I decided, was that my actions would be a response to betrayal, not its initiation. There was justice in that distinction, even if justice might look a lot like vengeance when viewed from a certain angle. For the next few days, I maintained a perfect facade of normalcy. I packed Richard's suitcase for Chicago as I always did, placing his toiletries in their designated compartments and ensuring his shirts were folded exactly as he preferred. I drove him to the airport early Monday morning, kissed him goodbye at the security checkpoint, and wished him a productive trip. "I'll miss you," he said, cupping my face in his hands. 3 days will feel like forever." I smiled up at him, thinking how easy the lie came to his lips. "I'll miss you too. Call me when you land." As I watched him walk through security, I wondered if he was already transitioning from Richard Blackwood, devoted husband, to Richard Blackwood, father to a girl named Lily with a recital on Tuesday evening. Back at home, I threw myself into further research. With Richard's flight information and hotel confirmation in hand, I had always managed his travel arrangements. I forwarded these details to Amanda, who confirmed she would be on the same flight, several rows behind him. Then I turned my attention to the apartment lease I had discovered. The address was on Beacon Street in Brookline, an upscale neighborhood not far from several private schools and parks. The lease had been in Richard's name only, but it indicated the apartment was for 2 occupants. Using public records databases that I had access to through my work, I searched for current information on that address. The apartment was now occupied by different tenants, but the property management company remained the same. I made a note to have Amanda investigate whether Richard had rented other properties through the same company. Next, I tackled the mysterious dates that had shown patterns of special purchases: April 17th, August 3rd, and November 12th. After some consideration, I had a sudden insight. Birthdays. Could April 17th be Lily's birthday? Was August 3rd Ava's? And what about November 12th? I searched online birth records for Chicago, focusing on births around 7 years ago for any child with the first name Lily. It was a common name, yielding hundreds of results even when narrowed by year. Without a last name, I couldn't determine if any of these children were connected to Richard. As evening approached, my phone rang with Richard's caller ID. "Just checking in," he said when I answered. The meeting ran late, but it was productive. "How was your day?" "Quiet," I replied truthfully. "Just catching up on some reading and errands." "That's nice," he said, and I could hear the hotel television in the background. "I should be back in the room by 8 tomorrow night. Want to FaceTime then?" 8 o'clock, after the recital noted in his calendar. "Actually, I'm having dinner with Lisa tomorrow, remember? How about when I get home around 10? "Perfect. Miss you." "Miss you too," I echoed, the words hollow in my mouth. After we hung up, I received an encrypted email from Amanda. "Subject under surveillance. Checked into Palmer House as planned. Attended afternoon meetings at Morrison Corp offices until 6 p.m., then took taxi to residential address in Lincoln Park neighborhood. Currently inside that location. We'll update with photos and details." Lincoln Park, an affluent family neighborhood, with excellent schools. The pieces were falling into place. Later that night, another email arrived with several attachments. The first was a photograph of a handsome brownstone on a tree-lined street. The second showed Richard entering the building using a key, carrying what appeared to be a small gift bag from FAO Schwartz. The third, taken through a ground-floor window with a telephoto lens, showed Richard kneeling to embrace a young girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with long dark hair similar to his own. The final photo nearly stopped my heart. Richard kissing a beautiful woman with auburn hair, his arms wrapped around her waist in a gesture of comfortable intimacy. Amanda's message was brief but devastating. Subject greeted by female, approximately 35-40, and female child, approximately 7. Appears to reside at this address based on familiar entry and neighbor interaction. Property records indicate house purchased 7 years ago by Richard Blackwood and Ava Blackwood as joint tenants. Child identified as Lily Blackwood based on mailbox. Further background checks in progress. Ava Blackwood, not a girlfriend or mistress, a wife. The room seemed to tilt as I stared at those words. Richard hadn't just established a relationship outside our marriage. He had created an entire parallel life, complete with another wife and a child. The legal ramifications alone were staggering. Bigamy was a felony in Massachusetts, punishable by state prison time. But beyond the legal issues, the personal betrayal was almost incomprehensible in its scope. How had he maintained this deception for so long? How had he justified it to himself? And most critically, which life was real to him? Was I the wife he truly loved but couldn't give him a child? Or was Ava his authentic partner, with me serving as some sort of backup or financial security? A strange calm settled over me as I saved Amanda's photos to my secure evidence file. Whatever emotional breakdown might be coming, it would have to wait. Right now, I needed information, clarity, and a strategic plan that would address every aspect of this betrayal. I sent Amanda a response. Please continue surveillance. Priority information needed. 1. Legal status of relationship with Ava. 2. Details about Lily, including birth date. 3. Financial connections between Chicago household and Boston income assets. Also, determine if subject will attend child's recital, tomorrow evening as noted in his calendar. Then I opened my laptop and began searching for the best divorce attorneys in Boston, specifically those who specialized in high net worth cases involving fraud and hidden assets. By midnight, I had appointments scheduled with 3 prominent lawyers for the following week, after Richard's return from Chicago. As I finally prepared for bed, I noticed Richard had texted while I was absorbed in my research. Just wanted to say goodnight. Hotel room feels empty without you. I stared at the message, marveling at his ability to compartmentalize. Was he lying in a hotel room? Or was he in bed with Ava in their Lincoln Park home? Did he send Ava similar messages when he was with me? Did he tell her he missed her when we were together? Instead of responding, I turned off my phone and lay in our king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling. The house felt cavernous and hollow, filled with expensive furnishings that suddenly seemed like mere props in an elaborate performance. For 12 years, I had been living in a carefully constructed fiction, believing my marriage was real while Richard orchestrated his dual existence with masterful precision. Sleep eluded me as questions multiplied in my mind. Did Ava know about me? Was she an innocent victim like myself, or a willing participant in the deception? Did Lily know she had a stepmother in Boston? How many other people were privy to Richard's secret? Friends, colleagues, family members? Had everyone been laughing behind my back all these years? By dawn, my shock and confusion had crystallized into something harder and colder: determination. Richard had orchestrated this elaborate fraud for years, making fools of both me and possibly Ava. He had deprived me of the truth and the ability to make informed choices about my own life. I would not allow that to continue. As the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, I made myself a promise. Richard's carefully constructed house of cards would come crashing down, but not immediately, and not in a way he could possibly anticipate or control. My revenge would be as methodical and patient as his deception had been. It would be comprehensive, targeting every aspect of the life he had built on lies. and most importantly, it would be executed with the same cold calculation he had employed all these years. Richard thought he was a master of deception and manipulation. He was about to discover he had married his match, twice over. Chapter 4. The Other Wife. The next day passed in a blur of planning and information gathering. Amanda provided regular updates from Chicago, confirming that Richard had spent the night at the Lincoln Park house rather than his hotel. In the morning, he had taken Lily to school, a prestigious private academy nearby, before heading to his business meetings downtown. More background information began to fill in the picture of Richard's Chicago life. Amanda's associate had uncovered marriage records showing that Richard had indeed legally married Ava Daniels, now Ava Blackwood, 8 years ago, 4 years after our own wedding. Their daughter, Lily Grace Blackwood, had been born on April 17th, which confirmed my suspicion about the significance of that date. The Lincoln Park house had been purchased in both their names, using a substantial down payment that coincided with the first major withdrawal from our joint investment account. Subsequent withdrawals aligned with mortgage payments, property taxes, and likely Lily's private school tuition. Most surprising was information about Ava herself. She wasn't some random woman Richard had met in Chicago, but a former colleague from his law firm in Boston. She had transferred to their Chicago office around 8 years ago, right around the time of their marriage. This suggested their relationship might have begun while both were still in Boston, possibly even before our own wedding. The thought made me physically ill. Had Richard been involved with Ava even as he stood at the altar with me, promising fidelity and devotion? Had our entire relationship been tainted from the beginning? I forced these thoughts aside and focused on the practical aspects of my situation. If Richard had committed bigamy by legally marrying Ava while still married to me, I had grounds not just for divorce, but for criminal charges. However, I wasn't yet sure if that was the direction I wanted to take. Prison time for Richard might be satisfying in some respects, but it would also impact Lily, who was innocent in all this. Furthermore, a public criminal case would expose me to scrutiny and pity, the duped wife, the fool who didn't realize her husband had another family. The thought was unbearable. No, whatever course I chose needed to preserve my dignity while ensuring Richard faced appropriate consequences for his actions. It also needed to address the financial aspects of his betrayal, the money he had diverted from our joint assets to support his Chicago family. In the early afternoon, Amanda sent another update. Richard had left his meetings early and returned to the Lincoln Park house, presumably to prepare for Lily's recital. She attached a photograph of him entering a florist shop near the house, emerging with what appeared to be a bouquet of pink roses. Subject appears fully integrated into family life, Amanda noted. Neighbor greeted him by name, asked about Ava and the little one. Subject responded comfortably, mentioned piano recital tonight, indicates established presence in neighborhood. I wondered what role Richard played in his Chicago life. Was he the devoted family man there that he could never quite be with me due to our inability to have children? Did the neighbors know he had a consulting practice that frequently took him to Boston, or did they believe he worked locally? The level of deception required to maintain 2 separate households across states was mind-boggling. At 7 o'clock, the time noted in Richard's calendar for Lily's recital, I received a series of photos from Amanda. They showed Richard and Ava seated in an auditorium, watching a small girl in a blue dress at a piano. Their expressions were those of proud, loving parents. In one image, Richard wiped what appeared to be a tear from his eye as he applauded. I stared at that photo for a long time, trying to reconcile this emotional, vulnerable Richard with the controlled, somewhat reserved husband I knew. In our years together, I had rarely seen him display such unguarded emotion. Was this his true self, revealed only in his other life? Or was he simply a masterful actor in both worlds? Later that evening, right on schedule, Richard FaceTimed me from what appeared to be his hotel room. I took the call in our home office, having carefully arranged the background to show nothing of my day's activities.